The Western Front battles of 1916 showed that even if you won, you lost. Hundreds of thousands of men were killed or wounded for advances measured in yards. By early 1917, both sides were running out of men to throw into the meat grinder. The French planned one final massive offensive to break the German lines and end the war. Over 130,000 French soldiers died in the attempt. Tens of thousands more mutinied. The Germans held the line not by being stronger, but by completely changing how defense worked. Okay, so, if you use these to fall asleep, subscribe. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I check them, and it's crazy seeing people from like Australia and Norway on the same video. Alright, tonight it's spring 1917 on the Western Front. But wait, get comfortable first. No, really check. Pillows, blankets, the whole deal. Where we're going, you'll want to be settled. It's April 1917, somewhere in northern France. Pre-dawn. Pitch black except for the occasional star shell turning night into sickly green day for exactly 3 seconds. You're in a funk hole. That's what they call these. Fancy name for an oval cave someone carved into the mud wall of the trench. Your bed is a dirt shelf. That's it. No mattress, no blanket. Just you, your soaking wet uniform and whatever rats decided to join you overnight. The smell hits you before anything else. Chloride of lime mixed with rotting sandbags, stagnant water, cigarette smoke from yesterday, something dead somewhere close, and underneath it all, the thick stink of thousands of unwashed men who haven't had a proper bath in weeks. Your feet. Oh man, your feet. They've been wet for 3 days straight. The water in the trench is ankle deep on a good day, knee deep when it rains, which it did. Yesterday, and the day before, your boots are full of cold water that's basically mud soup at this point. Your socks, if you can even call them that anymore, are just wet rags wrapped around swollen lumps of meat that used to be feet. Trench foot. Everyone's terrified of it. You've seen what it does. Feet go numb. Then they swell up like balloons, turn red, then blue, then black, then gangrene, then some guy with a saw takes them off. Over 20,000 men got it last winter alone. The officers check your feet twice a day now. It's the only thing they seem to care about more than the Germans. Someone's shaking your shoulder. Stand to, stand to. It's the company sergeant. He's moving down the trench, kicking boots, pulling men out of their funk holes. His voice is hoarse from yelling the same thing every morning for 3 years. You drag yourself up. Every muscle screams. Your back is a solid block of pain from sleeping on that dirt shelf. Actually, calling it sleeping is generous. You dozed. Maybe. Between the rats running over your face and the guy next to you coughing up half a lung every 10 minutes, it's stand to, the most dangerous time of day. Half hour before dawn, every single man in the Allied trenches climbs up onto the fire step. Rifles ready, bayonets fixed. You stand there in the dark, staring at nothing, waiting for the Germans to attack. Because dawn is when attacks happen. Or that's the theory. Everyone knows dawn is when attacks happen, which means both sides expect it, which means both sides prepare for it, which means nobody actually attacks at dawn because that would be suicide, but you still have to stand there, just in case. The guy next to you is shivering so hard his rifle's shaking. It's April, but it's freezing. Your wet clothes suck every bit of warmth out of your body. Your teeth chatter. Your hands are so numb you're not sure you could pull the trigger even if you needed to. Then the sun starts to come up, and right on schedule the Germans start the morning hate. Machine gun fire rips across no man's land. Artillery shells whistle overhead. Small arms fire pops and cracks. The British fire back. It's not aimed at anything. Nobody can see anything in the mist. It's just both sides saying good morning by trying to kill each other. The noise is unbelievable. Even after all this time, you never get used to it. It's not just loud. It's loud in a way that makes your chest vibrate, your ears ring, your thoughts scatter. You crouch below the parapet, hunched over, trying to make yourself as small as possible. Bullets whine overhead. One hits the sandbag right next to your head, and you feel the impact through the whole trench wall. This goes on for maybe 10 minutes. Then, like someone flipped a switch, it stops. The sergeant yells, "Stand down! You're alive." Again. Congratulations. The rum ration comes around. A sergeant carries a big jar marked SRD. Officially it means Supply Reserve Depot. Everyone knows it really means soon runs dry, or seldom reaches destination. Depending on who you ask, you get a cup. It's dark, thick rum that burns going down and hits your empty stomach like a punch. But it's warm. For exactly 30 seconds, you feel warm. Then breakfast. Hard biscuits so old they could stop bullets. Canned corned beef, or bully beef as everyone calls it. It's fatty, salty, and completely disgusting. You eat it anyway. You're always hungry. Always. An officer walks past inspecting rifles. Then feet. He makes you take off your boots. Your feet are pale and wrinkled like you've been in a bath for a week. Which you basically have. He nods. You're fine. For now. Trench maintenance, he says. Get to it. Welcome to April 1917. By this point, the war had been going for 2.5 years. The Western Front, that line of trenches stretching from Belgium to Switzerland, had barely moved. The Germans held most of what they'd taken in 1914. The British and French had tried to push them back in 1915. Disaster. Tried again in 1916. Another disaster. The Battle of the Somme the previous year killed or wounded over 1 million men on both sides. For gains measured in yards. Not miles, yards. Everyone was exhausted. Everyone was running out of men. Everyone wanted this thing to end. The Germans knew they were in trouble. Late in 1916, their Chief of Admiralty warned the Chancellor, "The war demands a decision by autumn 1917, if it is not to end with a general exhaustion of all parties, and thus disastrously for us." Translation: we need to win soon or we're all screwed. The Allies had the same idea. The French had a bigger army than the British. They'd take the lead. The plan was simple. Massive offensives on multiple fronts. Italy, Russia, the Western Front. Hit the Germans everywhere at once. They can't defend against everything. The French commander, Joseph Joffre, came up with a plan in November 1916. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, took one look at it and basically said, "This is garbage." He called it a complete farce. Said it repeated all the bloody stupidities of 1915 and 1916 and the old fatuous tactics of hammering away with human flesh and sinews at the strongest fortresses of the enemy. He wasn't wrong. But by January 1917, things changed. Russia was falling apart. Italy couldn't sustain a major offensive, and Joffre got replaced by a new guy, General Robert Nivelle. Nivelle was confident, like really confident. He'd just won a big victory at Verdun and thought he'd figured out the secret to breaking the stalemate. His method was simple: massive artillery followed by infantry assaults on narrow fronts. Just do it harder and faster than before. That's the plan. Brilliant. The British would attack around Arras to distract the Germans, draw their reserves north. Then the French would launch the main attack along the Chemin des Dames ridge. Nivelle expected it would be a knockout blow. The war would be over. The British commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, was not impressed, especially when he heard rumours that British forces might fall under French command. Haig basically lost his mind. "It would be madness to place the British under the French," he said. "I do not believe our troops would fight under French leadership. I am prepared to be tried by court-martial rather than betray the army." After lots of threats and yelling on both sides, they compromised. The British would attack to support the French, but they'd stay under British command. Haig wanted more time to prepare. He wanted the attack in May. Nivelle wanted February. They settled on April, so the plan was set. April 1917. Break open the Western Front. End the war. Go home. There was just one small problem. The Germans had a vote, and while the Allies were planning their big offensive, the Germans were planning something completely different. In 1914 and 1915, German doctrine had been all about attacking. Charge forward, take ground, win. But 1916 changed everything. The Battle of Verdun, the Somme, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers killed or wounded. The Allies could replace their casualties. They had reserves, colonial troops, fresh men. The Germans, not so much. They were running out of people. In September 1916, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff took over the entire German war effort. They looked at the situation and came to a simple conclusion. We can't win by attacking anymore. A German staff officer named Hermann von Kuhl wrote in his diary, "I spoke with Ludendorff alone about the overall situation. We were in agreement that a large-scale positive outcome is now no longer possible. We can only hold on and take the best opportunity for peace. We made too many serious errors this year." The Germans realised they'd been making a huge mistake. They were keeping too many men crammed into the front-line trenches, sitting ducks for Allied artillery, thousands of men packed together in narrow spaces just waiting to be blown up. They needed a new approach. In December 1916, they published a document, boring title, Principles of Command in the Defensive Battle in Position Warfare. Inside, revolutionary. The Germans basically reinvented defence. Instead of holding a strong front line at all costs, they'd let the Allies attack, let them come in, then destroy them. The new system had 3 zones. First, the Vorfeld zone, 1 or 2 lightly defended trenches at the front. Fine for day-to-day stuff. Sniping, small raids. But if the Allies attacked in force, the Germans would just leave, pull back, let them have it. Behind that, the battle zone, the Grosskampf zone. This was the main line of resistance. New trenches, reinforced bunkers, pillboxes, machine gun nests, everything designed to survive artillery and stop infantry cold. And behind that, a rear battle zone, more trenches, support facilities, and most importantly, fresh troops ready to counterattack. The strategy was called elastic defence. The Germans would bend, withdraw, then snap back. They'd wait for the attackers to exhaust themselves, wait until they'd outrun their artillery support, wait until they were tired, disorganised and exposed, then hit them with massive counterattacks and take back the lost ground. It was smart, really smart. They also figured out terrain. Reverse slopes specifically. Put a machine gun on top of a hill and everyone can see it. Allied artillery will blow it up. But put it on the downward slope behind the crest. The attackers can't see it until they're right on top of it, and Allied artillery can't hit it because the hilltop blocks the shells. Shallower field of fire, but way more effective. The Germans reorganised their divisions to make this work. Each regiment was split into 3 battalions. Each battalion manned a different zone: front, middle, back. This made coordination easier, communication simpler, withdrawing and counter-attacking faster. But the most drastic change was about to come. Operation Alberic. In February and March 1917, the Germans did something that seemed completely insane. They abandoned a huge chunk of their front line, miles of trenches they'd held for 2 years. They just left. But before they left, they destroyed everything. Buildings, blown up, roads, torn up, wells, poisoned, trees, cut down. Anything the Allies could use, gone. And they left presents, booby traps, everywhere. Rum jars that exploded when you opened them, spades that set off mines when you picked them up, souvenirs that detonated bombs when you touched them. One British battalion lost 5 men in a single day just from booby traps. A British officer described what they found. The German trenches we've taken over are deep, well-constructed, and surprisingly dry. Masses of beer bottles, unfortunately empty, are strewn about, and gun cotton attached to shell cases and grenades has been left ready to explode when picked up or accidentally kicked. The Germans fell back to a new line, the Hindenburg line, built specifically with the new defensive principles shorter, stronger, and up to 45 miles further east. This withdrawal freed up 13 German divisions. 13. That's tens of thousands of soldiers who could now be used elsewhere. The Allies followed cautiously. They found scorched earth. They found death traps. They found a completely new battlefield. Nivelle's plan for a quick breakthrough had just gotten a lot more complicated. But he didn't seem to care. He'd been planning this offensive for months. He'd been talking about it to anyone who'd listen. He was convinced it would work. A few changes to the German line? No problem. The offensive would go ahead as planned. Back in the trenches, you don't know any of this yet. You're just trying to survive until the next rum ration, trying to keep your feet from rotting off, trying not to think about what's coming, because something's coming. Everyone can feel it. The artillery has been piling up for weeks, shells stacked everywhere, guns being dragged into position, officers with maps looking nervous. Spring offensive, that's what they're calling it. The big push, the one that'll end the war. You've heard that before, but this time they say it's different. This time they've got it figured out. New tactics, better artillery, more firepower. This time it'll work. You lie back in your funk hole. The rats are back, scurrying in the dark. Your feet throb. Your back aches. Your stomach cramps with hunger even though you just ate. You close your eyes and try to sleep, because tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, you're going over the top, into no man's land, toward the German trenches, and all those new tactics and better plans. You're about to find out if they're worth anything. Unlike your warm bed right now, where the biggest threat is maybe dropping your phone on your face, these men were sleeping in mud with rats waiting to die. The water by your bedside is clean. Theirs was likely to give them cholera. Your feet are dry. Theirs were rotting. April 1917 was coming, and with it, one of the most controversial offensives of the entire war. A battle where even winning meant losing, where tactical success meant strategic failure, where thousands would die trying to prove that this time, finally, they'd figured out how to break the deadlock. They hadn't. The Germans had spent 1916 learning a hard lesson. You can't just pack men into trenches and expect them to survive when the enemy has thousands of artillery guns pointed at you. Verdun taught them that. The Somme hammered it home. At Verdun, the Germans attacked. They threw hundreds of thousands of men at French positions. The battle lasted 10 months. The Germans gained maybe 5 miles. The cost? Around 340,000 German casualties. The French lost about the same. At the Somme, the British and French attacked German positions. 5 months of fighting. British casualties on the first day alone were over 57,000 men. Total casualties for both sides, over 1 million. For territorial gains that you could walk across in an afternoon. The old way of fighting wasn't working, not for anyone. When Hindenburg and Ludendorff took over in September 1916, they looked at the casualty reports and realized Germany was going to run out of men before the Allies did. Simple math. Britain had its empire to draw from. France had colonial troops. Russia had millions of peasants. Germany had Germany. Ludendorff told his staff officer Hermann von Kuhl the truth. A large-scale positive outcome is now no longer possible. We can only hold on and take the best opportunity for peace. They couldn't win by attacking anymore. They had to make defence so effective that the Allies would exhaust themselves trying to break through. The problem was how the Germans had been defending. Traditional defence meant holding the front line at all costs. Pack the forward trenches with men. When the enemy attacks, shoot them. When they shell you, take cover and hope you don't die. Hold every inch of ground. This made sense in theory. In practice, it meant thousands of men sitting in the front trenches, perfectly positioned for Allied artillery to blow them apart. The Germans needed a new system. In December 1916, they published the new doctrine. The document had a bureaucratic title that makes you want to fall asleep just reading it. But inside was a complete revolution in defensive warfare. The new system had 3 zones. Zone 1, the Vorfeld, the outpost zone. This was 1 or 2 lines of lightly defended trenches at the very front. You'd put a few men there, enough to watch for enemy activity, enough to handle small raids or snipers. But if the Allies launched a major attack, a real offensive with artillery and thousands of infantry, the men in the Vorfeld would just leave, fall back to the second zone, let the Allies have those first trenches. This went against every military instinct. You don't just give up ground. Commanders had been court-martialed for less, but the year Germans realised those forward trenches were death traps. Why keep men there just to get killed? Zone 2, the Grosskampf zone, the battle zone. This was the real defensive line. Multiple trench lines arranged in depth, reinforced bunkers, concrete pillboxes, machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. This wasn't a single line, it was a network. If the enemy broke through at one point, they'd just run into another line of defences, and another, and another. The key was depth. The battle zone stretched back hundreds of yards, sometimes over a mile. An attacking force would capture the first trench and think they'd broken through. Then they'd hit the second line, then the third, each one manned by fresh troops. Zone 3, the rear battle zone, more trenches, supply depots, aid stations, and most importantly counterattack divisions. These troops would wait, let the enemy attack, let them take ground, let them push forward until they're tired, disorganised, and far from their own artillery support. Then hit them. Hard. The counterattack troops would smash into the exhausted attackers and take back everything that has been lost, often in a single day. This was elastic defence. Bend but don't break. Give ground, then take it back. Make the enemy pay for every yard twice. The Germans also figured out terrain, specifically reverse slopes. Here's the problem with putting a machine gun on top of a hill. Everyone can see it. Allied observers spot it. Artillery gets the coordinates. Shells rain down. Your machine gun position is destroyed before the infantry even attacks. So the Germans moved their machine guns to the reverse slope, the downward side of the hill just behind the crest. From the Allied perspective, they'd see the hill. They'd shell the top of the hill. Their artillery would pulverize the crest. Then their infantry would charge up, expecting to find destroyed German positions. Instead, they'd reach the top, and suddenly there's a machine gun nest 10 yards away, completely intact, and it opens fire. The attacking troops had no cover. They were silhouetted against the sky. The machine gunners had a perfect field of fire, and Allied artillery couldn't help because the shells would hit their own men. It was brutal, and it worked. The Germans reorganized their divisions to make this system work. Each division had 3 regiments. Each regiment had 3 battalions. Instead of spreading everyone across the front in a thin line, they arranged units in depth. 1st Battalion holds the Vorfeld. 2nd Battalion mans the battle zone. 3rd Battalion waits in reserve, ready to counterattack. When the Allies attacked, the 1st Battalion would fall back through the 2nd Battalion. The 2nd would hold. The 3rd would prepare to counterattack. Simple, clean, effective. But changing doctrine on paper is one thing. Making it work in reality is another. The Germans needed to actually build these new defensive positions. They needed shorter, stronger lines that required fewer men to defend. They needed to free up divisions that could be used as mobile reserves. That's where Operation Albric came in. Albric was a dwarf from German mythology, an evil dwarf who guarded a cursed treasure. The name fit. The plan was simple and insane. The Germans would abandon a huge section of the front line. They'd pull back to a new defensive line they'd been building in secret, the Siegfriedstellung. The Allies called it the Hindenburg line. We're talking about voluntarily giving up ground, miles of territory that Germany had held since 1914, trenches they'd built and defended for over 2 years, towns and villages they'd occupied. Just abandon it. Walk away. The withdrawal started in February 1917. Thousands of German soldiers began pulling back, but before they left, they destroyed everything. This wasn't a retreat. It was scorched earth. Every building that could provide shelter, destroyed. Churches blown up. Houses burned. Barns demolished. If the Allies wanted these towns, they'd get rubble. Every road and railway, torn up. Rails removed. Bridges blown. Crossroads mined. The Allies would have to rebuild everything just to move supplies forward. Every well, poisoned or filled in, trees cut down, even the fruit trees. Anything that could provide wood, food, or water was destroyed. One British soldier described entering a village the Germans had abandoned. Not a building left standing. The church was a pile of stones. Every house had been systematically demolished. The wells were filled with rubble and corpses. The fields had been sown with mines. But the Germans went further. They left gifts, booby traps, everywhere. A British officer wrote about what his men encountered. The German trenches we took over were deep, well constructed and surprisingly dry. Masses of beer bottles, unfortunately empty, strewn about. Sounds nice, right? Wrong. Gun cotton attached to shell cases and grenades left ready to explode when picked up or accidentally kicked. We lost 5 casualties in this way. A rum jar sitting on a table. You open it. Boom. It's wired to a grenade. A spade leaning against a wall. You pick it up to start digging. Boom. It's connected to a mine. A German helmet lying on the ground. Looks like a souvenir. You reach for it. Boom. The Germans knew what soldiers would want. Alcohol, tools, souvenirs. So they turned all of it into traps. Some booby traps were simple. A wire stretched across a doorway at ankle height, connected to a grenade. Some were elaborate, delayed fuses that would detonate hours or days after the position was occupied. British patrols entered the abandoned German trenches carefully. Very carefully. They'd probe everything with long sticks before touching it. Check every room before entering. Look for wires, disturbed dirt, anything unusual. Men still died. One battalion reported losing more men to booby traps than to German artillery in their first week occupying the new positions. The withdrawal itself was a masterpiece of military planning. German engineers had been building the Hindenburg line in secret for months. New concrete bunkers, deep dugouts, defensive positions built from scratch with the new doctrine in mind. The line was shorter than the old front. This freed up 13 divisions, tens of thousands of soldiers who could now be held in reserve, ready to move wherever they were needed. The line was also stronger. Every position was sited with overlapping fields of fire, machine guns positioned to support each other, artillery pre-registered on likely approach routes, everything designed to maximize defensive firepower. When the Allied forces cautiously advanced into the abandoned territory, they found a wasteland. A British patrol reported entering a German trench just 1 hour after the Germans had left. Pretty sharp work, the officer noted, but what they found wasn't a gift. It was a trap. The Germans had pulled back to better ground, higher ground, drier ground. The Allies now occupied a stretch of devastated territory with no infrastructure, no supplies, no shelter. And ahead of them was a defensive line stronger than anything they'd faced before. The French and British commanders looked at their maps and realized the situation had changed completely. Nivelle's plan had been built around attacking the Noyon salient, a bulge in the German lines that could be pinched off, surround it, cut it off, destroy the divisions inside. Classic military tactics. But the salient was gone. The Germans had withdrawn from it. The bulge in the line didn't exist anymore. The whole operational concept of the offensive had just been invalidated. Nivelle's subordinates pointed this out. General Joseph Michelet, commander of the Reserve Army Group, said the German withdrawal had changed everything. They needed to reconsider the plan. Nivelle refused. He'd been planning this offensive for months. He'd sold it to the politicians. He'd convinced the British to support it. He'd promised it would work. He wasn't about to cancel it just because the Germans moved. Another French general, Philippe Pétain, questioned whether the planned artillery bombardment would even work. The attacks were supposed to be concentrated. Overwhelming firepower on narrow fronts to blast a hole through the German lines. But now those narrow fronts were in different places. The German positions were deeper. The artillery would be spread across a broader area. Pétain said the artillery barrage would be like dispersing the waters of Lake Geneva over the length and breadth of the Sahara Desert. Not enough concentration, not enough power. Nivelle ignored him too. There was another problem: operational security. Nivelle had been talking about this offensive openly for months, in meetings, in dispatches, to politicians, to journalists. The man couldn't keep his mouth shut. On April 4th, 1917, German forces captured a French officer carrying complete plans for the offensive. Attack positions, timing, unit assignments, everything. The Germans knew exactly what was coming, where it would hit, when it would start, how many divisions would attack. The element of surprise was gone. French intelligence warned Nivelle. The Germans have reinforced the sector. They've doubled the number of divisions in some areas. They know we're coming. Nivelle's response? Good. That just means the victory will be more impressive. The man had committed to this offensive so completely that he couldn't see reality anymore. He'd argued with his own generals for months. He'd fought with Haig about command arrangements. He'd staked his entire reputation on this attack. He couldn't back down now, so the offensive would go ahead as planned. April 16th, 1917. The French would attack along the Chemin des Dames. The British would attack at Arras to draw German reserves north. The Germans would be waiting for them, in their new defensive positions, with their elastic defence doctrine ready to be tested for the first time, with reinforcements standing by to counterattack. The French soldiers preparing for the offensive didn't know about the captured plans. They didn't know about the German reinforcements. They didn't fully understand the new defensive system they were about to run into. What they did know was that every previous offensive had been a bloodbath, and everyone was promising that this time would be different. They'd heard that before too. While the Germans were reinventing defence, the British were finally learning how to attack. It had only taken 2 years of getting slaughtered. The Somme in 1916 taught the British Army some hard lessons. The problem was they'd gone into that battle thinking their artillery could do all the work. Shell the German trenches for a week straight. Turn everything into rubble. Then the infantry just walks across and occupies the destroyed positions. Didn't work out that way. The artillery destroyed some positions, but not all of them. The Germans had deep dugouts, 30, 40 feet underground, reinforced with concrete and timber. Men could survive down there even with shells landing directly overhead. When the bombardment lifted and British troops went over the top, German soldiers climbed out of their dugouts, set up their machine guns, and opened fire. Rows of British infantry walking across no man's land in neat lines got cut down. First day of the Somme, over 19,000 British soldiers killed, another 38,000 wounded, for minimal gains. The British looked at this disaster and tried to figure out what went wrong. One problem was how the infantry advanced. They moved in rigid lines, shoulder to shoulder. The thinking was this kept units together and made command easier. Officers could see their men. Men could see their officers. Simple. But it also meant when a machine gun opened up, it could sweep an entire line. Dozens of men dead in seconds. Another problem was command structure. When things went wrong, junior officers and sergeants would wait for orders from higher up. But in combat, communication breaks down fast. Officers get killed. Runners get killed. Telephone lines get cut by shells. So junior leaders would wait for orders that never came. Men would huddle in shell holes, pinned down by machine gun fire, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. By the time orders arrived, if they arrived at all, the moment had passed. The attack had stalled. After the Somme, the British started changing how they fought. First, infantry tactics. Instead of advancing in lines, troops would move in open formation, small groups using cover, moving from shell hole to shell hole, much harder for machine guns to hit. Second, command. Junior officers and NCOs got more authority to make decisions on their own. If your superior officer is dead and you're pinned down by a machine gun nest, don't wait for orders. Figure it out yourself. Canadian Corps Commander Julian Byng told his officers straight up, "In an emergency, the man who does something is sometimes wrong, but the man who does nothing is always wrong." Third, firepower. British platoons in 1916 were basically just riflemen, good for shooting at things, not great for attacking fortified positions. By 1917, every platoon had specialists. Bombers trained to throw grenades, rifle grenadiers who could launch grenades farther than you could throw them, and most importantly, a Lewis gun, a light machine gun, one per platoon. This gave infantry units their own suppressing fire. They could pin down German positions while other sections moved forward and attacked from the flank. Fourth, artillery. The British took a hard look at what their guns had been doing wrong. At the Somme, artillery fire was spread across a wide front. The idea was to hit everything, but hitting everything means not hitting anything hard enough. German strongpoints survived. Barbed wire wasn't cut. Artillery batteries behind the lines kept firing. The shells themselves were a problem. Lots of them were duds, faulty fuses. The shells would bury themselves in the mud and not explode. This meant the artillery could fire for days and still leave large sections of barbed wire intact. British troops would go over the top expecting the wire to be cut. Instead, they'd find it still standing. They'd have to try and cut through it manually while German machine guns fired at them. By 1917, the British introduced a new fuse, instantaneous fuse number 106. These exploded on contact instead of burying into the ground. Much better for cutting wire. They also improved coordination between artillery and aircraft. Observation planes would spot German positions and radio back coordinates. Counter-battery fire became a priority. Instead of just shelling trenches, British guns would target German artillery. At the Somme, each British gun covered about 50 metres of front. At Arras, they concentrated the guns, one gun per 20 metres, much more destructive. The British also started using creeping barrages more effectively. This was where artillery fire would move forward in a line just ahead of the attacking infantry. The shells would land, say, 100 yards ahead of your position. Then the barrage would shift forward. The infantry would advance right behind it. Timing was critical. Move too slow, and the Germans recover before you reach them. Move too fast and you walk into your own artillery. At Arras, the British planned the barrage carefully, rehearsed it, made sure infantry officers understood the timing. There was one more advantage the British had: underground. British miners had been digging tunnels under no man's land for months. Some were for placing massive mines under German positions. Others were subways, literal underground passages where troops could move from the rear trenches to the front line without being exposed to German fire. On April 9, 1917, the British were ready. 18 British divisions, 3,000 artillery guns, 48 tanks, all aimed at German positions around Arras. The attack was supposed to be a diversion. Draw German reserves north so the French offensive along the Chemin des Dames would face less resistance. But the British put everything into it. This wasn't a half-hearted feint. This was a full-scale offensive. At 5:30 a.m., the artillery opened up, thousands of guns firing at once. The ground shook. The noise was beyond description. Then, at exactly the right moment, the infantry went over the top. In some places it went well, in others it went very badly. Vimy Ridge was where it went well. Vimy Ridge was a long hill that dominated the surrounding area. The Germans had held it since 1914. Previous French attacks in 1914 and 1915 had failed to take it, cost 150,000 French casualties. The ridge was considered nearly impregnable. The Canadian Corps got the job. 4 Canadian divisions, about 100,000 men, supported by British artillery and engineers. The Canadians had spent months preparing. They rehearsed the attack on training grounds behind the lines, full-scale mock-ups of the German positions. Every soldier knew exactly where he was supposed to go and what he was supposed to do. They studied aerial photographs. Officers memorized the terrain. platoons practiced their specific objectives until they could do it in their sleep. The artillery plan was extensive. Counter-battery fire had identified 83% of German gun positions before the attack. When the barrage started, British and Canadian guns systematically destroyed German artillery. Underground, Canadian miners had dug tunnels and placed mines under key German positions. When those mines went off, the explosions were massive. Entire sections of German trench disappeared. At 5:30 a.m. on April 9th, in a snowstorm, the Canadian Corps attacked. The first wave went in behind a creeping barrage. The new tactics worked. Small units moving tactically, using the training they drilled for months. The first German line fell quickly. Many of the defenders were still in their dugouts, stunned from the bombardment. The ones who made it out found themselves facing Canadians who knew exactly what they were doing. Then the second wave leapfrogged through the first. Fresh troops moved through the exhausted first wave and kept attacking. The Germans couldn't establish a defensive line because the attacks kept coming. By the end of April 9th, most of Vimy Ridge was in Canadian hands. One of the 4,000 Germans captured that day was a 17-year-old named Hermann Kraft. He'd been huddled in a dugout while shells rained down. His sergeant ordered everyone up the stairs to defend the position. The sergeant went first, immediately got shot and tumbled back down the stairs. An older soldier, 22 years old, came back down and told everyone to abandon their weapons. The position was hopeless. Canadians were everywhere. Kraft climbed up the stairs. A huge Canadian soldier was standing there with what looked like a baseball bat, ready to bash anyone who didn't surrender. Another soldier had no helmet, just a small tuft of hair on top of his head, face painted white and red, looked absolutely terrifying. Kraft was convinced he'd been captured by Indians. The story isn't totally reliable, but it shows how disoriented and scared the German defenders were. The Canadian success at Vimy was a combination of everything the British had learned. Good planning, thorough preparation, effective artillery, new infantry tactics, and troops who knew their jobs. A Canadian private named Bill Tapper from the 38th Battalion wrote about the artillery support. We went over supported by the Lahore Divisional Artillery, and were they crackerjack. The Germans had been beaten before we got there. It was a walkover. It wasn't actually a walkover. Men died, lots of them. But compared to the Somme, compared to previous attacks, it was a success. The Germans made mistakes too. They hadn't fully implemented the elastic defence at Vimy. They kept too many men in the forward positions, and their reserves were too far back to counterattack effectively. By the time German reinforcements arrived, the Canadians had dug in. The ridge was lost, but Vimy Ridge was just one part of the Battle of Arras. Other sectors didn't go as well. South of Arras, near a village called Bullecourt, the Australian and New Zealand forces ran into serious problems. The British Fifth Army commander, General Hubert Gough, wanted to get the Anzacs into the fight, but his artillery support wasn't ready yet. The guns were still being moved into position. Gough decided to use tanks instead. A dozen tanks would lead the attack. The tanks would crush the German wire. The infantry would follow. Simple. The tanks had barely any time to prepare. They moved up to the front line in the early hours of April 11th. Most of them got stuck in mud or broke down before reaching the German positions. The ones that made it knocked out some machine gun nests, but they couldn't get through the wire. Australian Major Percy Black reportedly yelled to his men, "Come on, boys, bugger the tanks." The infantry attacked on their own. Some units broke through, got into the German trenches, started pushing forward. but they were too weak to exploit the breakthrough. Key German positions held out. The attacks that succeeded became isolated. The Germans counterattacked. In some places they got behind the Australian positions and cut them off. The Anzacs were pushed back to their starting lines. The attack failed. What went wrong? Gough had been impatient, rushed the attack before everything was ready. The artillery hadn't had time to register targets properly, hadn't cut the wire, hadn't suppressed the German positions. Communication broke down. British artillery officers thought certain German positions had been captured when they hadn't, so they stopped shelling them. German troops in those positions just kept firing. An Australian officer, Lieutenant Colonel Drake Brockman, blamed the tanks. The tank crews seemed to know little or nothing about attacking with infantry, nothing about the particular operation they were supposed to participate in. In one case, the tank commander hadn't even synchronized his watch. He was 5 minutes behind. He continued, "Tank crews didn't even know the direction of the enemy." Of the 11 tanks in the attack, only 2 survived. On the German side, unlike at Vimy Ridge, the elastic defence worked. The village of Bullecourt became a strong point. German troops there fired on the flanks of attacking Australians, disrupted the advance. Then German reserves counterattacked at just the right moment when the Anzacs were exhausted. So the Battle of Arras had mixed results. Vimy Ridge was a clear success, a major position taken, thousands of prisoners captured, good example of everything working together. Bullecourt was a failure, poor planning, inadequate artillery support, tanks that weren't ready, attacks that couldn't be sustained. But remember, the Battle of Arras was supposed to be a diversion. The main event was happening further south. The French offensive along the Chemin des Dames, Nivelle's war-winning attack, the one that was supposed to break the German lines and end the war. That offensive was about to begin, and it was going to be a disaster. The Germans were waiting. Their elastic defence was ready. The reverse slope positions were manned. The counterattack divisions were in place. French soldiers moved into their jumping-off positions. They'd been promised this attack would be different. New tactics, more firepower, overwhelming artillery support. They'd been promised victory. What they were about to get was a bloodbath. April 16th, 1917. 6 a.m. The French offensive began with 14 days of artillery bombardment, 11 million shells fired at German positions along a 40-kilometre front. The noise was constant for 2 weeks straight. The ground shook. Buildings miles behind the lines had their windows blown out from the concussion. Men couldn't hear each other even when shouting. The French had 6,100 guns, more firepower than they'd ever concentrated in one place. The plan was simple. Blast everything. Destroy the German defences. Then the infantry walks in and occupies the ruins. Nivelle expected the breakthrough within 24 to 48 hours, 3 days maximum. At 6 a.m. on April 16th, the French 5th and 6th Armies went over the top. 160 Schneider tanks led the attack, another 16 Saint-Chamond tanks. These were the French answer to British tanks. Slow, unreliable. But they had guns and armour. Behind the tanks came waves of infantry, thousands of men, many of them colonial troops, Senegalese soldiers from French West Africa, Moroccan units. These men had been promised this would be quick, a breakthrough, then exploitation, then victory. The first hour went well. French troops captured the first German line. Some units reached the Chemin des Dames ridge. Officers sent back reports. Success. We're breaking through. Send reinforcements. Then everything fell apart. The German defenders in the first line had followed their new doctrine. When the French attacked, they pulled back. Let the French have those forward trenches. Why die defending positions that didn't matter? The real German defensive line was further back. On the reverse slope of the ridge, French troops reached the top of the Chemin des Dames ridge. They'd fought through the first line, taken casualties but kept moving. They are exhausted but excited. They'd done it. They'd broken the German line. Then they started down the other side of the ridge. That's when the machine guns opened up. German positions on the reverse slope, completely untouched by French artillery. The shells had been hitting the front slope, the crest of the ridge. The German guns were 20, 30 yards further back, protected by the hill itself. The French infantry was silhouetted against the sky, tired, disorganized from the fight through the first line. Many officers already dead or wounded. The machine guns fired. Men dropped in rows. The survivors tried to find cover, but there wasn't any. They were on an open slope, nowhere to hide. Some tried to advance, got cut down. Others tried to retreat back over the crest, got shot in the back. The Senegalese troops of the 10th Colonial Division got hit worst. An entire battalion almost wiped out in minutes. They descended into the valley of the Aisne River. Machine guns positioned on the reverse slope caught them in a crossfire. General Blondlat, commander of the 2nd Colonial Corps, wrote about what happened. Infantrymen descended into the valley. There they were welcomed and fixed in place by deadly fire from numerous machine guns located on the reverse side of the slope, outside the reach of our projectiles, undamaged. The troops suffered considerable losses in a few minutes, particularly leaders. After not succeeding in crossing this deadly zone, they halted, took cover, at some points withdrew to the first trench to their rear. The elastic defence was working exactly as designed. The French had broken through the outpost zone, captured trenches, felt like they were winning, then hit the real defensive line and got destroyed. The second wave of French infantry went in during the afternoon. They were supposed to exploit the breakthrough, push through the gap and keep going. But there was no gap. The first wave was pinned down or retreating. The second wave ran into them. Units got tangled together. Command broke down. Officers couldn't find their men. Men couldn't find their officers. The tanks tried to help. Some tanks managed to reach the village of Juvincourt and helped capture it. But tanks in 1917 were slow, unreliable, mechanically primitive. They broke down constantly, and they were massive targets. German artillery crews had been trained specifically on how to knock out tanks, aim for the tracks, aim for the vision slits, use armour-piercing rounds. French tanks started getting destroyed, one after another, burning, crews bailing out if they could. Some couldn't. They burned to death inside. Where French troops did advance, they had to stop if the units next to them couldn't keep up. You can't push forward if your flanks are exposed. German machine gunners would hit you from the side. So successful units had to wait for the struggling units to catch up, which meant nobody made real progress. By the end of the first day, French troops were digging in wherever they'd managed to reach. Conditions were terrible. Rain had started. The ground turned to mud. The trenches filled with water. Morale crashed. These men had been promised a breakthrough, a quick victory. They'd been told the new tactics would work. The artillery would destroy everything. The tanks would crush the defences. The infantry would just walk through. Instead, they'd been slaughtered. The colonial troops were hit hardest. The Senegalese soldiers had been thrown into some of the worst fighting, highest casualty rates. They'd trusted their French officers who told them this attack would succeed. By nightfall on April 16th, the colonial units were refusing to attack again. Not mutiny exactly, just refusal. We're not doing that again. Send us back. The French command tried again the next day, April 17th. New attacks, fresh troops thrown in, more artillery, more tanks, some gains. They captured more ground, took over 5,000 German prisoners. But it was clear this wasn't the breakthrough Nivelle had promised. The Germans had reinforced. More divisions moved into the sector. They'd known this. Attack was coming. They were ready. German reserves launched counterattacks. French units that had pushed forward got hit by fresh German troops. Fighting went back and forth over the same ground. By April 20th, 4 days into the offensive, everyone knew it had failed. Hermann von Kuhl, the German staff officer, wrote later about his certainty that the battle was already won. The first 2 days had decided the fate of the offensive. Since the breakthrough had not occurred immediately, it would never occur. He was right. Everything had gone wrong for the French. First, the weather. Rain. Constant rain. Turned everything to mud. Slowed the advance. Made artillery observation impossible. The artillery couldn't see where they were shooting. They couldn't adjust fire. They just kept shelling the same coordinates whether Germans were there or not. Second, German air superiority. April 1917 was called Bloody April by the British. The Germans had better planes, better pilots. They controlled the skies. French observation aircraft got shot down. Artillery couldn't see. Infantry couldn't get air support. Third, German reinforcements. French intelligence had warned Nivelle. The Germans have doubled the number of divisions in this sector. They know we're coming. They're ready. Nivelle didn't care, or didn't believe it. Either way, the French attacked into a much stronger force than expected. Fourth, the creeping barrage was too fast. The artillery fire was supposed to move forward just ahead of the infantry, but the French barrage moved too quickly. Infantry couldn't keep up, so they'd advance and find German positions that hadn't been hit by artillery. Machine guns intact, defenders ready. Fifth, the wire. In some places the German wire wasn't cut. Artillery had been focused on other targets, or shells had been duds, or the Germans had time to repair breaches before the infantry arrived. French soldiers reached the wire and had to stop, while German machine guns fired at them. Sixth, the tunnels. The Germans had built extensive tunnel networks under the Chemin des Dames Ridge, deep underground, protected from artillery. German troops could shelter there during the bombardment, then emerge when the French infantry attacked. Seventh, ammunition. The French had fired 11 million shells during the preparatory bombardment. They'd expected a short battle, a quick breakthrough, so they hadn't stockpiled enough ammunition for a prolonged fight. After a few days, ammunition ran low, artillery support decreased, infantry attacks went in with less support, but the biggest problem was the German elastic defence itself. The French kept hitting what they thought was the German line. They'd break through, capture trenches, think they'd won, then discover there was another line behind it, and another, and another. Every time they advanced, German counterattacks would hit them. Fresh German troops who'd been waiting in the rear, the French infantry, would be exhausted from attacking, running low on ammunition, low on officers, disorganized. The German counterattacks would push them back, sometimes all the way to their starting positions. The French would have to attack the same positions again the next day. It was exactly what the elastic defence was designed to do. Absorb the attack. Let the enemy exhaust himself. then snap back and retake the lost ground. By early May, the French kept trying to advance. Smaller attacks, local operations, trying to salvage something from the offensive. Nothing worked. The casualties mounted. 134,000 French troops killed or wounded, for minimal territorial gains, and then the mutinies started. French soldiers began refusing to attack, not deserting, not running away, just refusing to go over the top again. They'd hold the line, they'd defend their positions, but they wouldn't attack anymore. Entire divisions refused orders. Officers were powerless. Shoot a few men and the rest would still refuse. Shoot everyone and you have no army. The French army was breaking. Nivelle had promised this offensive would win the war. Instead, it nearly destroyed the French army. On May 15th, Nivelle was replaced. Philippe Pétain took over. His first job was dealing with the mutinies, restoring morale, rebuilding an army that had lost faith in its commanders. The spring 1917 offensives were over. The British had some local successes at Vimy Ridge, some failures at Bullecourt, mixed results at Arras. The French offensive at the Chemin des Dames was a complete disaster. The Germans had held. Their new defensive doctrine worked. The elastic defence had proven itself against the largest offensive the Allies could mount. The riddle of trench warfare remained unsolved. The Allies could take ground, but they couldn't achieve a breakthrough, couldn't break the German lines decisively, couldn't end the war. Spring 1917 had been supposed to be different. New tactics, more firepower, better planning. It would work this time. It didn't. So what went wrong? How did Nivelle take one of the largest armies in the world, give them months to prepare, concentrate more artillery than had ever been used before, and still fail so completely? The easy answer is the Germans were ready. They had better tactics. The elastic defence worked. But that's not the whole story. Nivelle made mistakes, a lot of them, and he kept making them even when people told him he was wrong. Start with timing. Nivelle originally wanted to launch the offensive in February. If he'd done that, things might have been different. The Germans were still pulling back to the Hindenburg line. They were stretched thin. The element of surprise still existed, but Haig demanded more time. The British weren't ready, so February became April. By April, the Germans had completed their withdrawal. They were in their new positions, reinforced, ready. The surprise was gone. Nivelle knew this. His intelligence. Officers told him. German strength in the sector had doubled. They have more divisions than expected. They know we're coming. Nivelle's response? The victory will be even more impressive. That's not confidence. That's delusion. Then there's operational security. Nivelle talked. A lot. He discussed the offensive in meetings with politicians, with journalists, with basically anyone who'd listen. He was trying to build support for his plan, get people excited about the coming victory. But loose lips sink ships, or in this case, get your offensive compromised. On April 4th, German troops captured a French officer carrying complete plans for the offensive. Everything. Unit positions, attack timings, objectives, the whole operational plan. The Germans knew exactly what was coming and where. Some commanders would have called off the attack at that point, or at least delayed it, changed the plan, attacked somewhere else. Nivelle refused. The attack would go ahead as scheduled. Same place, same time, same plan. Why? Because he'd committed. He'd argued with Haig for months about command arrangements. He'd fought with his own subordinates about the plan. He'd promised the politicians this would work. He'd staked his entire reputation on this offensive. He couldn't back down. His ego wouldn't let him. Military historians have a term for this: strategic blinkers. The inability to change a plan when new information comes to light. You become so focused on your original idea that you can't see reality anymore. Nivelle had strategic blinkers. His subordinates tried to warn him. General Joseph Michelet, commander of the Reserve Army Group, pointed out that the German withdrawal had changed everything. The operational concept didn't work anymore. They needed to rethink the attack. Nivelle ignored him. General Philippe Pétain questioned whether the artillery concentration was sufficient. The attacks were supposed to be on narrow fronts, overwhelming firepower in small areas. But the fronts weren't that narrow anymore. The firepower would be dispersed. Pétain compared it to spreading the waters of Lake Geneva across the Sahara Desert. Not enough impact. Nivelle ignored him too. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who'd initially supported Nivelle, started having doubts. The plan looked like all the failed offensives of 1915 and 1916, just bigger. Same bloody tactics, same results expected. Lloyd George later said Nivelle in December had been a cool and competent planner, but by April he'd become a crazy plunger. The man had lost perspective. There's another problem with Nivelle's thinking. He assumed the Germans would fight the same way they had at Verdun in 1916. They didn't. At Verdun, the Germans had held their forward positions, defended every trench, fought for every yard. That's what Nivelle had beaten. That's what his tactics were designed to overcome. But the Germans had changed. The elastic defense was completely different. Nivelle's plan assumed the Germans would stand and fight in their forward trenches. The Germans didn't. They pulled back, let the French have the forward positions, then destroyed them from the battle zone. Nivelle saw the German defenders as a passive force, something to be overcome with enough artillery and enough men. He didn't account for them adapting, changing their tactics, fighting smart instead of just fighting hard. In war, the enemy gets a vote. They don't just sit there and let you execute your perfect plan. They respond. They adapt. They try to win. Nivelle forgot that. The cost of his mistakes was paid in blood. 134,000 French casualties in a few weeks. For territorial gains that didn't matter. Villages that had no strategic value. Trenches that didn't change the overall situation. And then came the mutinies. This wasn't a few soldiers refusing orders. This was systematic collapse across multiple divisions. It started in late April. A unit would receive orders to attack. The officers would give the command. The men would refuse, not aggressively, not violently. They'd just say no. We'll hold the line. We'll defend our positions, but we're not attacking anymore. Officers tried everything: threats, promises, appeals to patriotism. Nothing worked. By May, entire regiments were in mutiny. Divisions were unreliable. The French army was breaking down. Some units took it further. Soldiers would gather and discuss grievances. They weren't being paid enough. Leave was being denied. Conditions were terrible, and they were being sent to die in pointless attacks. They weren't wrong. French soldiers weren't pacifists. They weren't cowards. They'd been fighting for 3 years. They'd survived Verdun, the Somme, endless smaller battles. They knew how to fight. They were willing to fight, but they weren't willing to die for nothing. And that's what Nivelle's offensive felt like, dying for nothing. The French High Command panicked. Mutinies during wartime are a death penalty offence. You can shoot the ringleaders, make examples, restore discipline through fear. But how many can you shoot? 12? 100? When entire divisions are refusing orders, You can't shoot them all. You don't have enough bullets, and even if you did, you'd have no army left. The French shot 49 soldiers. Pour encourager les autres, as the saying goes, to encourage the others. It didn't work. The mutinies continued spreading through May and into June, eventually affecting 54 divisions. That's most of the French army. The Germans never found out. If German intelligence had known the French army was in mutiny, they could have attacked, broken through, won the war. But the French managed to keep it quiet. Soldiers were confined to their camps, mail was censored, officers kept their mouths shut, and the Germans, busy with their own problems, didn't notice. Nivelle was removed from command on May 15th. Too late to save his reputation. Too late to prevent the disaster. Pétain took over. His job was to restore the army, make it functional again, get soldiers willing to fight. Pétain understood something Nivelle didn't. You can't just order men to die. You have to make them believe their deaths mean something. He started by improving conditions, better food, more regular leave, actual rest periods behind the lines. Small things that showed the army cared about its soldiers as humans, not just as ammunition. He also changed tactics. No more grand offensives, no more promises of breakthrough and victory, just limited attacks with clear objectives, attacks that could actually succeed. Pétain's famous line, "We wait for the Americans and the tanks." The Americans had entered the war in April 1917, but they'd take months to arrive and train. The tanks were primitive but getting better. Eventually Pétain believed the Allies would have enough advantages to win, but not now, not yet. For now, defend, survive. Don't waste lives on futile attacks. Slowly the mutinies ended. Soldiers didn't suddenly become enthusiastic, but they stopped refusing orders. The French army became functional again. Barely. The spring offensives of 1917 were supposed to end the war. They didn't. They barely changed anything. The British at Arras took Vimy Ridge, a real achievement. Thousands of German prisoners, strategic ground captured, but not a breakthrough, not a war-winning victory. The French at Chemin des Dames took some villages and a few miles of trenches, at the cost of breaking their own army. The Germans held. Their elastic defence worked. They'd proven that the Allies still hadn't solved the riddle of trench warfare. For the soldiers in the trenches, nothing changed. Same mud, same rats, same danger, same endless routine of stand-to, maintenance, fear, boredom, death. You're still in that funk hole carved into the trench wall, still trying to keep your feet from rotting, still wondering if today's the day you die. The big offensive came and went. Thousands died. The line moved a little, then stopped. And you're still here. The promises were empty. The tactics didn't work well enough. The breakthrough didn't happen. Meanwhile, back in your present, you're lying in an actual bed, with actual sheets, in a room with walls and a roof. Your feet are dry. You're not hungry. Nobody's trying to kill you. The contrast is staggering. Those men in 1917 would have given anything for what you have right now. A safe place to sleep, clean water, food, peace. They didn't get it. Many of them never would. The war went on for another year and a half. More offensives, more casualties, more mud and blood and death. Spring 1917 was supposed to be different. The tactics were better, the preparation more thorough, the commanders more experienced. But war doesn't work like that. The enemy adapts, plans fall apart, chaos takes over. The Germans proved that defense could win, that you didn't need to attack to succeed. Just make the enemy pay so heavily for every yard that he gives up. The Allies learned that breakthrough was still impossible, that even with overwhelming firepower and new tactics, trench warfare remained a stalemate. Both sides learned that this war was going to keep going, that there was no quick victory, no knockout blow, just grinding attrition until someone couldn't keep fighting anymore. The soldiers learned that promises from commanders meant nothing, that grand plans didn't survive contact with reality, that survival was more luck than skill, and the dead learned nothing, because they were dead. 134,000 French casualties in the Nivelle offensive, thousands more British at Arras, thousands of Germans defending. For what? A few miles of muddy ground, some destroyed villages, trenches that would change hands again in future battles. Was it worth it? The commanders thought so. They had their reasons, strategic objectives, military necessity, national honour. The soldiers had a different perspective. They saw their friends die, watched men get blown apart by shells, stepped over corpses, lived in conditions worse than animals. They knew the truth. Spring 1917 hadn't changed anything. The war would keep going. More men would die, for the same reasons, with the same results, and they were right. The spring offensives of 1917 didn't end the war. They just showed everyone that ending the war was going to be harder than anyone thought. By summer 1917, the Western Front looked almost the same as it had in early April. The trenches ran from Belgium to Switzerland. The Germans held most of what they'd taken in 1914. The Allies held their positions. Some ground had changed hands. Vimy Ridge was in Canadian hands now. A few villages along the Chemin des Dames were occupied by French troops. Some sections of trench had new owners, but the strategic situation hadn't changed. Germany still occupied Belgium and parts of northern France. The Allies still couldn't break through. The stalemate continued. The casualty lists told the real story. British and Empire forces at Arras suffered around 150,000 casualties. Dead, wounded, missing. For territorial gains measured in miles, French forces in the Nivelle offensive took 134,000 casualties, plus the mutinies that nearly destroyed the army. German defenders lost roughly similar numbers. They held their lines but paid for it. Total casualties for the spring 1917 offensives were somewhere around 500,000 men. 500,000 in a few weeks of fighting for an outcome that didn't change the war. Both sides claimed victory. The Allies pointed to Vimy Ridge, to ground captured, to prisoners taken. See, we're learning. We're getting better at this. The Germans pointed to their successful defence. The elastic defence worked. We held the line. We stopped their breakthrough. We're winning. Both were lying to themselves. The truth was simpler. Nobody won. Everybody lost. Just like 1915. Just like 1916. The tactical lessons from spring 1917 should have been clear. The Germans proved that elastic defence worked. Don't pack men into forward trenches. Use depth. Make the enemy fight through multiple defensive lines. Counterattack when he's exhausted. It works. The Allies proved that better tactics helped but weren't enough. The improvements at Vimy showed what was possible with good planning, thorough preparation, and effective coordination. But even perfect execution couldn't achieve breakthrough. The problem was deeper than tactics. The fundamental nature of trench warfare favoured defence over offence. Machine guns, artillery and barbed wire made attacking too costly. Even when attacks succeeded locally, they couldn't be sustained or exploited. Commanders on both sides understood this intellectually. But understanding a problem and solving it are different things. The Germans couldn't win by defending forever. They needed the Allies to give up, to decide the cost was too high. But the Allies weren't giving up. The Allies couldn't win without breaking the German lines, but they couldn't break the lines without casualties they could barely afford. And every failed offensive made their armies less willing to try again. So the war continued. More battles, more offensives, more casualties. Later in 1917, the British would try again at Passchendaele. Another offensive, another bloodbath. More lessons learned the hard way. The war wouldn't end until 1918, and it wouldn't end because of a brilliant offensive or perfect tactics. It would end because Germany finally ran out of men, resources, and will to keep fighting. But that was still more than a year away. For the soldiers who survived spring 1917, life went back to normal. The normal of trench warfare. Stand to every dawn and dusk. Maintain the trenches. String barbed wire. Fill sandbags. Dig new positions. Repair old ones. Pump water. Fight rats. Check your feet for trench foot. Clean your rifle. Wait for the next attack. Try not to die. The promises of breakthrough and victory were forgotten. Everyone knew now they were lies, or at best wishful thinking. Soldiers stopped believing their commanders. Why should they? Nivelle promised his offensive would end the war. It didn't. Haig promised Arras would break the Germans. It didn't. The gap between what officers promised and what actually happened was too large to ignore anymore. This affected morale in ways that are hard to measure. Soldiers would still follow orders, still attack when told to. But the enthusiasm was gone. The belief that this attack would be different, this time it would work, disappeared. Men fought because they had to, because refusing meant execution, because their friends were there, because going home wasn't an option until the war ended, not because they believed in victory. The mutinies in the French army showed what happened when that disconnect became too large. When soldiers decided dying for nothing wasn't acceptable anymore, the French got lucky. The mutinies could have lost them the war. If the Germans had known, if they'd attacked during that vulnerable period, the French lines might have collapsed, but the Germans didn't know. And by the time the French army was functional again, the moment had passed. Still, the mutinies changed things. French commanders became more cautious, more aware that they couldn't just throw men at German positions and expect obedience. Soldiers had limits. The British learned similar lessons, though without the same crisis. Soldiers would fight, but commanders needed to show competence, prove that attacks had purpose, that casualties meant something. This meant fewer grand offensives, more limited attacks, better planning, more concern for whether an objective was actually achievable, progress, slowly, at enormous cost. For you, lying in your bed right now, all of this is history. Events that happened over a century ago, numbers in books, stories told by people who are long dead. But for the men who lived through it, spring 1917 was everything. It was days of bombardment that made your ears bleed, attacks through machine gun fire that killed your friends, nights spent in mud trying to sleep, fear that never really went away. They wanted what you have: safety, comfort, a full stomach, dry feet, a place to sleep where nobody's trying to kill you. Most of them never got it. They died in later battles, or survived with wounds that never really healed. Physical wounds, mental ones. The lucky ones made it home after the war ended, but home wasn't the same. They weren't the same. You can't go through something like spring 1917 and come out unchanged. Some men talked about it, wrote memoirs, told their children and grandchildren, tried to explain what it was like. Others never spoke of it, couldn't. The words didn't exist to describe what they'd experienced, or maybe the words existed but saying them out loud made it real again, made them remember things they'd tried to forget. Both responses made sense. There's no right way to process something like that. The big question people ask about World War I is why? Why did it last so long? Why did so many die? Why couldn't they figure out how to end it? Spring 1917 shows part of the answer. Both sides were trying to win, really trying, using their best tactics, their best commanders, all their resources, and they still couldn't break the stalemate. The Germans developed elastic defence. It worked. The Allies couldn't break through. The Allies improved their tactics, better artillery, better infantry training, better coordination. They took ground at Vimy Ridge, showed it was possible to succeed. But success at Vimy didn't translate to success everywhere. Bullecourt failed. The Nivelle offensive failed. Even when tactics worked, they didn't work well enough to end the war, so it continued. Another year, another 500,000 casualties, another spring of broken promises and dashed hopes. The men in the trenches understood something their commanders often didn't. Victory wasn't about tactics or strategies or grand plans. Victory was surviving today, making it to tomorrow, getting through the war alive. Everything else was just noise. Commanders talked about breakthrough and exploitation and war-winning offensives. Soldiers talked about rum rations and dry socks, and whether that shell was going to land in your trench or the one next to you. Different perspectives, different priorities. The commanders weren't wrong exactly. Someone had to think about strategy, about how to win the war, about what the next offensive should target. But they were disconnected from the reality their soldiers faced. The mud, the rats, the constant fear, the friends who died for no good reason. That disconnect caused the mutinies, caused the collapse of morale, made soldiers stop believing. By the end of spring 1917, everyone was exhausted. The Germans had held their lines but taken heavy casualties. The French army was broken and being rebuilt. The British had fought hard and gained little. Nobody had won. Everybody was tired, and the war was going to keep going. That's the real lesson of spring 1917. Not about tactics or strategies, not about elastic defence or creeping barrages or new training methods. The lesson is that sometimes there are no good answers. Sometimes you're stuck in a situation where every option is terrible, and people die no matter what you do. The commanders in 1917 faced that reality. They tried new approaches. Some worked better than others, but nothing worked well enough. The soldiers faced that reality every day, stuck in trenches, unable to advance, unable to retreat, just endure, survive, hope. It took another year and a half for the war to end. More battles, more casualties, more offensives that succeeded or failed but didn't change the fundamental situation. Eventually Germany collapsed, not from one decisive defeat, but from accumulated exhaustion, economic collapse, internal revolution, the slow grinding down of everything. The Allies won, but at a cost that made winning feel hollow. 10 million dead, 20 million wounded, entire generations scarred, countries bankrupted, empires destroyed. And for what? Territory, pride, national interest. Ask the men in the trenches. They'll tell you it wasn't worth it, but they didn't get to decide. They just had to live with the consequences, or die with them. Spring 1917 was supposed to be different. It wasn't. It was just another chapter in a war that shouldn't have lasted as long as it did, shouldn't have cost as much as it did. Shouldn't have happened at all, maybe. But it did happen, and hundreds of thousands of men paid the price. You're warm now, safe, comfortable in ways those men could barely imagine. The worst thing that might happen tonight is you drop your phone, or can't fall asleep, or have a bad dream. They would have traded places with you in a heartbeat. Remember that. When things feel hard, when life seems difficult, you have things they died wishing for. Rest now. Let the weight of the day settle. Tomorrow you'll wake up in the same bed, in the same safe room, with the same comfortable